We begin with the president's agenda. As he attempts to push through his ambitious priorities, he's taking time to highlight his signature legislative achievement. President Biden spoke about the bipartisan infrastructure deal he signed into law back in November. He detailed some of the upcoming projects nationwide, saying they will create jobs. Mr. Biden also says the funding will make unprecedented investments in the country, impacting big and small communities alike.
We're just getting started. We're building back better than ever before. Clean water for every American. We've never done that before. Now we're going to do it. High-speed internet for every American. We've never done that before. Now we are. Connecting forgotten communities, capping wells that are dangerous, strengthening our power grid to make it more resilient to extreme weather changes. These are investments our country has never fully made. Now we are.
For more on this, I want to bring in Zeke Miller. He's a CBS News political contributor and White House correspondent, or we should say reporter, for the Associated Press. Zeke, what stood out to you from the president's speech?
Well, the big news was that $5.5 billion funding that first tranche of federal spending to repair or replace 15,000 bridges across the country. And the emphasis by the president that it's not just the big bridges that connect states across large bodies of water or are on the interstate highway system. It's the small ones in neighborhoods that may be overlooked by states and even local officials at times and that aren't prioritized for the funding. This is a part by the president to sort of emphasize to the American public, whether you live in a big city or in a small town or in a rural area, that you're going to feel some benefits of this bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed last year.
Oh, Democratic Senators Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin, nothing's changed there. They continue to stand in the way of the president's agenda on spending measures and voting rights. So what's the mood like in the White House when it comes to chances of any of this getting through Congress?
In the short term, there's this sense of frustration at the White House that they're not going to be able to move forward through something as ambitious as that Build Back Better law that the president was trying to pass late last year, or these two broader voting rights legislation that Democrats have been working on over the last several weeks, and that they had hoped to pass by Monday. It's now Tuesday next week, but those seem destined to fail, given that opposition from Senators Sinema and Manchin. There's at the same time a little bit of optimism among some corners of the White House and the Democratic Party that something less ambitious, more targeted on both fronts, both on that social spending side and on voting, could potentially get passed in time for the midterm elections this November. But time is really ticking before Congress essentially ceases to govern as lawmakers go back to campaigning ahead of the November elections.
What stands out to me is that much of this legislation, the social spending legislation, impacts the state of West Virginia incredibly. What are people saying there? There's certainly been a lot of reporting on how these programs impact West Virginia in particular. The expiration today, Friday, was is the first month in more than half a year where American families are not seeing monthly child tax credit payments, and that is particularly hurting families in West Virginia. There's been a lot of. At the same time, it's important to remember that West Virginia has voted overwhelmingly for Republican candidates, and that Joe Manchin himself is still overwhelmingly popular in that state. So there's often a disconnect between the way policies are received and their impact on people, and then how people view elected officials. And I think we're seeing that as sort of a case study in that voters who who might have been affected positively by this legislation are still backing Joe Manchin and backing Republicans at the presidential level despite that. And I think that's a challenge for Democrats. They thought that they can sort of make an argument that this program is going to help you back it, get Joe Manchin to back it, and they have not been able to make that connection thus far. Let's segue to the voting rights bill. Is there anything that the Biden administration can do to prevent, the restrictions passed at the state level from impacting the ballot box come November?
We're likely to see a renewed focus on the Department of Justice oversight and efforts by the federal government to sue to block some of those laws. We saw a little bit of that last year. We're likely to see more of that stepping up as the midterm elections near. There's also that room, as I mentioned, for some sort of a bipartisan compromise, likely around the Electoral Count Act sort of essentially rules governing, particularly at the federal level, how elections are tabulated and reported up to the federal government. For the case of the presidency, like we saw the efforts by former President Trump to interfere with that count and overturn that count back in 2020. There are Republicans who want to work with Democrats to try to pass something in a more limited fashion there. But in terms of a broader scale legislation at the level Democrats have been proposing and fighting for, that the president so forcefully called for on Tuesday, that seems to be dead in the water at the moment. There just doesn't seem to be a path forward in Congress right now for that.
Wow, dead in the water. Zeke Miller, thank you so much.